So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new lecture of the Land of Writing series. So today we are really happy to welcome Gabriel Nocchi Macedo, who is Assistant Professor of Papyrology and Greek at the University of Liège and Director of the Centre de Documentation de Papyrologie Littéraire, also said CEDOPAL. His research focuses on the history and materiality of books in antiquity and the transmission and reception of Greek and Latin literature. So, Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well. I should say that I'm going to talk about Greek because I am a papyrologist, a philologist, classical philologist, not an Egyptologist. I hope I won't bore you too much. And I apologize for any mistakes I might make concerning Egyptian things that you know surely much better than I do. The presence of Greek in Egypt spans over a period of at least 19 centuries if we consider the very first attestations of the language, which date to well before Alexander's conquest. The oldest Greek texts from Egypt are most probably the famous inscriptions on the leg of one of the colossal statues of Ramesses II on the facade of the temple at Abu Simbel. These inscriptions were carved by two Greek soldiers from Caria that were part of the mercenary troops hired by Psammetichus II to fight the Nubians in 593-92 before Christ. And here you have a transcription and translation of the inscription. Before the Hellenistic period, Greek is known to have been used in Egypt in specific locations and contexts, notably in the port city of Naucratis that had been founded by the Milesians under Psammetichus I in the 7th century BC, and within the community of the Helleno-Memphites, that is the Ionian Greeks that had settled in Memphis. It is from such a Greek-speaking community that probably stems one of the most famous literary papyri of all, the Berlin Papyrus 9075, a book roll containing considerable portions of an otherwise unknown lyric poem, The Persians, by 4th century poet and musician Timotheus of Miletus. This papyrus was found in 1902 in the vicinity of a sarcophagus near Abu Zir, and both the archaeological context and paleography point to a dating in the first half of the 4th century BC. So an example of Greek culture, Greek writing, before the beginning of the Hellenistic times, but before the conquest of Alexandria, in any case. With the establishment of the Ptolemaic kingdom, Greek progressively becomes both the language of culture and one of the main vectors of communication in Egypt, coexisting with Egyptian and later on, after the Roman conquest, but on a rather different level with Latin. Greek had somehow precedence over other languages in as much as it was the official language of government, even though, as you of course know, Egyptian never ceased to exist. It was still spoken by the people, part of the people at least. Greek would only lose its status as official language after the Islamic conquest. And even then, this happened gradually. Some years after the conquest in the 7th century, the Arabic governor of Egypt passed a law requiring that official documents be written in Arabic. But even then, the replacement of Greek and Coptic as languages of communication would still take a couple of centuries to be completed. Classical Greek literature is attested in Egypt in manuscripts until the 7th century. Greek Christian literature a bit longer than that, and Greek script will still be used in the country up until the 9th century, when sort of the Arabization of Egypt is more or less accomplished. As a small contribution to this series of lectures on Egypt, Land of Writings, organized by Gaëlle, I would like to just offer a survey, if you will, some paleographical considerations on Greek papyrological texts from Egypt, focusing on the question of whether there have been Egyptian types of script, that is, graphic typologies within the Greek writing system that emerged in Egypt and that distinguish themselves morphologically, so paleographically, from Greek scripts used elsewhere. This is a very difficult question to answer, and I can only attempt to answer it partially. Before I go into it, I have to explain why that is. First of all, that is the fact that apart from epigraphical texts, the vast majority of ancient written sources in Greek come from Egypt, were preserved in Egypt, were found in Egypt. These are the so-called papyrological sources, which include papyri, of course, but also parchment fragments, ostraca, and wooden tablets. They cover a time span between the 4th century before Christ and the 8th century after Christ. It is extremely difficult to estimate how many Greek papyri there are in collections spread out around the world. A very rough count of the published pieces brings us to over 80,000, of which approximately 8,000 are literary, and the remainder is then a sort of documentary, non-literary text, official documents, private documents, everyday writing. If we were to include the non-published, the unedited material that's lurking around in libraries and museums, we would be close to 1.5 million papyri. So papyrologists won't be out of work anytime soon, even if in the current situation, many are out of jobs, sadly. Of these 80,000, roughly estimated 80,000 Greek papyri, less than 2,000 are of non-Egyptian origin. What are these papyri and where do they come from? The most famous corpus of non-Egyptian papyri are the Herculaneum papyri, that is the carbonized remains of a private Roman library situated at the city of Herculaneum on the Bay of Naples. And this library was a specialized library because its books, at least its Greek books, because there were some Latin, the Greek books were all philosophical treatises, Epicurean philosophical treatises. The oldest of the Herculaneum papyri date from the 3rd century before Christ and might have been brought from Greece to Italy, and the most recent date to the 1st century AD, and were local products, were produced in Italy. They all date, of course, before the year 79, when the Vesuvius erupted and carbonized the city, the town. Fortune, or misfortune, I should say, has it that very few Greek manuscripts come from Greece itself. The few papyri that were uncovered in the country were chance finds. The best preserved of these, and that you see on the small photo, there's a bigger one later, is the Derveni papyrus, found in 1962 in a tomb near Thessalonica. It preserves a commentary to an Orphic poem and is one of, with the Timotheus papyrus that I showed you, one of the oldest attestations of a Greek manuscript writing. It dates to the 4th century BC. After Egypt, the richest depository of Greek papyrus is Palestine, where sites such as Khirbet el-Kom, Nesana, and the famous caves on the Dead Sea, Qumran, Murabat, Nahal Hever, Nahal Selim, have yielded both documentary and literary papyri in Greek. This photo that you see, this codex, is actually a bilingual Greek and Latin papyrus, a bilingual glossary to Virgil that was found in in Messana. The texts from these different locations in Palestine date from the 3rd century BC to the 7th century AD, so quite a long time, but much fewer than in Egypt, of course. In Mesopotamia, and especially in the Macedonian colon of Dura Europus, founded under Seleucus I, over 200 papyri show witness to a rather vigorous presence of Greek culture and scribal practices, particularly in the Roman period. A few other locations where Hellenization was less accomplished and less enduring have yielded a smaller number of papyri. We can mention Avroman in Kurdistan, where 2 parchment documents from the 1st century BC were uncovered, and the famous city of Ai-Khanoum, capital of the short-lived Greco-Bactrian kingdom. And in Ai-Khanoum, there were found 2 pieces of dried earth holding mirror imprints of texts, of two texts, literary texts. And they were found in what seems to have been the library of the palace in Ai-Khanoum. We have some Greek papyri from Nubia, and also a number of papyri that were found in Egypt, but we know for sure because the text tells us that they were written elsewhere in Asia Minor, in Palestine, and in Syria. Many of these documents belong to a very famous, the most famous Greek papyrological archive, the Zenon archive, a group of 3rd century BC manuscripts that originally belonged to a man named Zenon of Connaus. He was secretary to a Apollonius. Apollonius was the finance minister of Ptolemy II. The documents in this archive reveal Zenon's business transactions and dealings both in Egypt and in other parts of the Mediterranean world. And we know that some of them were written by local scribes in regions such as Caria, Lycia, Pamphylia, and Syria, and then were sent to Egypt, to Zenon. We have a very asymmetrical landscape from a paleographical point of view, because we have much more material from Egypt than from anywhere else, which means that studying Greek paleography in antiquity consists mostly in studying Greek writing from Egypt with limited comparisons from elsewhere. This configuration has led paleographers to the conclusion that Greek script has had a uniform development in antiquity, meaning that the typologies and morphological features observed in non-Egyptian material do not differ substantially from those in Egyptian material. Some scholars like Wilhelm Schubert in 1925 interpreted this graphal homogeneity as a proof of the cultural cohesion in Greek civilization. Since then, this view has been nuanced, both historically and paleographically. Edoardo Crisci, for example, offered in his 1996 book Scrivere Greco fuori d'Egitto the first detailed paleographic analysis of non-Egyptian papyri from Eastern regions, putting forward the similitudes and differences in respect to scripts from Egypt. If there are clearly local specificities in the graphic manifestations of different regions of the Greek world, it has to be noted that the situation that we have in the Greek world in antiquity is nothing comparable to the graphical particularism that we will know in later stages, like in the Byzantine period or in late antiquity, early Middle Ages in the Latin-speaking world. In these contexts, you have what is called graphical particularism, that is, scripts that are proper to different places, and that can be, we can identify where the script comes from, sometimes to which city, sometimes even to which monastery, just by looking at it, just by how the script looks. We don't have this level of particularism in antiquity in the Greek world. The kind of particularism that we do have in the Greek world is a much more subtle, if you will, much more difficult to really delineate and understand. Within Egypt, where we have the biggest documentations, we cannot, for instance, talk about local hands. Some paleographers, but very few. It's still a very unstudied topic. Some paleographers speak of local styles, so small differences in the style of writing in different areas of Egypt. Herman Harauer, who published a paleography handbook in 2010, talks about the Cleopolite style, the Oxyrhynchite style, so local styles within Egypt, but very sort of superficially, and this question still needs to be studied and to be confirmed. I'm still very sort of uncertain about the possibility of identifying differences within Egypt. But in any case, more work needs to be done to understand this phenomenon. What we have in terms of particularism in ancient Greek script is, as I said, much more subtle. It is like, if you will, variations on the same theme. You have sort of basic typologies of writing in different times, used in different contexts, and in different localities, different regions of the Greek world. These typologies will appear slightly different, slightly differently stylized, if you will. And these are the ones that I would want to talk about, to present today. The earliest, the writing of the earliest Greek papyri, so 4th century, is modeled on that of stone inscriptions. Paleographers sometimes call this the epigraphical style of writing, with each letter being drawn individually as if it were limited by a frame. And it is perfectly aligned with the letters before and after it. Script at this point, as it was, as far as we can judge, fairly uniform, with no distinction between documentary and literary hands. Here you see two of the oldest papyrus that we have, the Derveni papyrus from Greece, which has a literary text, and a Greek document from 310, the Elephantine marriage contract. And hopefully you can see on the photo that the scripts basically follow the same pattern, sort of square, rectangular, very angular letters, where every stroke is done individually. Every letter is an individual entity. Then with pen writing, as opposed to writing on stones, it is in the 3rd century that we start to see a difference between pen writing and epigraphical writing. For the sake of rapidity, to write more quickly, the sharp angles of the letters will become more round, and the overall tracing of characters, the so-called ductus, becomes more and more simplified. We have the emergence of the cursives, which basically means that the letters are written more quickly, more in a more simplified tracing, and that they will not be individually drawn, if you will, one after the other. They will touch themselves and sometimes be ligatured to themselves. It's the appearance of the ligature that defines the cursive writing. Cursive will be used mostly in documents and in everyday writing, whereas for book production, for book hands, literary hands, the script sort of retains a slower ductus and a more letters will still be distinguished and separated one from another, because book hands, as I will talk about later, tend to be more conservative. The period where this occurs, starting in the 3rd century BC, corresponds to the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, when Egypt, of course, underwent dramatic political, administrative, cultural, linguistic transformations that were accompanied by an intensification in scribal activity, in book production, of the literary facet. We only have to think of the Library of Alexandria, but also in bureaucratic practice, in juridical practice, and in everyday transaction between private persons. So a lot of writing started being done at this period, and a lot of activity in scribal workshops of different kinds. In the mid-3rd century BC, we have what seems to be the earliest example of a style of writing that seems, as far as we can judge, to be of Egyptian origin in Greek. This script is found in the aforementioned Zenon archive, in some documents of the Zenon archive, documents that were sent to Zenon by his boss, by Apollonius, the Dioiketes, the finance minister of Ptolemy II. So they were sent from Alexandria to Zenon, who was settled in the countryside. These documents were not all written by the same scribe, but they do follow the same graphic patterns. The best known example is this letter that you see on the screen, dated to 260 BC. It is a letter from Apollonius, so from the finance minister, to a certain Apollodotus. I will read the first lines. You can follow on the screen. I'll try to show it with a little arrow. Apollonios Apollodoti haiden, ean tines ton hexagonton, ton siton ex Syrias, diagraphosin humin, etas timas, eto parabolion. As you can see, or as I hope you can see, this is a very sort of compressed script. It's very horizontal script. The letters seem to be somehow stretched sideways. Look at the delta, the alpha, they're squashed down. And even if it's not really a cursive, because the letters are not ligatured, they sometimes touch, but they are not ligatured. This sort of, it seems that they are glued to each other. It's just a continuation of strokes, one after the other. This is a highly stylized, even somehow rigid script that seems to have originated in the offices, government offices in Alexandria, because it is found only in official documents coming from Alexandria. Italian paleographers have named it the Cancerellesca Alessandrina, Alexandria Chancery script. The artificiality of this script had a purpose, the purpose of making the script and the origin of the document immediately recognizable. Looking at a text written like this, one should quickly realize that it's an official document emanating from the highest authorities in the capital. And the distinctiveness of this script is evident when we compare it to other contemporary scripts, sometimes within the Zenon archive, where we have that are not so formal, and we see scripts that are much more fluid, where the ligatures seem to be much more natural, where letters are not sort of always compressed and rigidly drawn. So there is in this script sort of they were going for a certain look that conferred authority, to officiality to the document. And this is a phenomenon that we see for the first time here, mid-3rd century BC, with these Alexandria Chancery script, but which is not limited. It will reoccur in other periods and in other places. There is Chancery script much later in Constantinople. There is a Chancery script also that is typical to Ravenna. And even in Alexandria itself, some 6 centuries later, we have another Chancery script that was used. So we're still in Alexandria. We're still dealing with official documents and with another very, very stylized type of script, even more impressive, I would say, than the one that we saw now. This script is sometimes referred to with the name of the Subatianus Aquila-Type. Subatianus Aquila was a prefect of Egypt, so the highest authority in the country in Roman times. And the script was named after him because of this document that you see in the screen, which is now kept on the screen, which is now kept in Berlin. It is an edict addressed by the prefect Subatianus Aquila to the strategos of the Arsinoate nome. The document refers to releasing forced laborers. So it is dated to the 27th of December of 209. And as you can notice, this is also a very particular script. If the one that I showed you before in the Xenon archive was compressed horizontally, this is a very elongated script that is marked by a vertical sort of a look. Letters are sort of drawn up and down. And there is a striking contrast between letters that are very big and other letters that are sometimes very small. You can see the alpha here or here. The delta is very reduced. At the tips of letters, at the end of strokes, there's often little buckles or little loops, little hooks that are purely ornamental. Let me just give you the beginning of the text. So you can see what the script looks like. So, Subatianus Aculas, Theoni strategoi, Arsinoetu haiden. So it's the salutation formula at the beginning of the letter. Subatianus Aquilas to Theon, the strategos of the Arsinoites. Greetings. No? This is not at all a typical script for the period. In the 3rd century, cursives were already very much in use in Egypt, especially in documents where professional scribes knew how to write very quickly. Actually, in this very same document, you have a text by another hand here at the bottom, and this is a typical 3rd century cursive, not this one. This one is, again, a very stylized, artificial script that, just as the one I showed you before, was supposed to look very solemn, very grand, sort of as almost like a stamp to show this is a document emanating from the highest authority. This is an important document that comes from the power, the powerful instances. This can also be seen somehow in the layout of the document. There is only 6 lines occupying the whole written surface. The letters are very big. There are big spaces left between the different sections of the text. So there is a whole aesthetic program here that has to do with the context from which the document emanates. There is also, at the same time, another interesting phenomenon. We see this is the Subatianus Aquila is the chancery script from Alexandria, but there were also other chanceries, other offices in other cities of the country. And they also had sometimes the script also has a particular look, a particularly bureaucratic look that we can see. This is another edict by the same prefect, Subatianus Aquila. It dates to 210, so 1 year later. But it was written most certainly elsewhere. It's from Tebtunis. And this script is also has some similarities to this one, in as much as the letters are also tend to be somehow elongated. There's also loops and hooks, so the ornamental elements. The letters, the sizes of the letters are contrasting, but it doesn't try to emulate the solemnity, the grandeur that the Alexandrian script has. It's sort of a poorer cousin of this script that was perhaps also supposed to look bureaucratic, to look official, but on a lower level, if you will. One of the, as you of course know, one of the defining elements of the history of Egypt is multiculturalism, and then multilingualism, and to use a term recently coined, multigraphism. So the presence of many different types of scripts, sometimes within already the Egyptian language. I recently read this book from 2021 by Edward Love about script switching in Roman Egypt in Egyptian, and the different scripts used for Egyptian, and it is fascinating how this contact between scripts operates, and of course then the contact between Egyptian and Greek, and between Egyptian scripts and the Greek script. The contact between Egyptian and Greek has been the object of much scholarly attention, and I won't attempt to say anything very important about that. But as far as paleography goes, I think there remain quite a few questions to be answered. We know that Egyptian scribes and Greek scribes had different practices. That Greek scribes would use the kalamos, which was a thick and hard reed to write, while Egyptians would use the rush with a soft tip. We know that in bilingual documents, here I just put an example on the screen, that the scripts would sometimes switch instruments when they switched languages. Sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes they would use just one. But in terms of contact between the scripts and sort of influence or contamination between Egyptian script, Demotic, more precisely, and Greek, there hasn't been much said, as far as I know. Perhaps because it's a very difficult thing to analyze. Demotic and Greek are different kinds of systems now, logographic, alphabetic. And I don't know if that doesn't seem to have much contamination between the two. I've asked some Egyptology colleagues about this, but I think maybe it's also a point that deserves to be studied, to see if I don't know if in some documents, in bilingual documents, some elements in the Egyptian writing look Greek, or vice versa, that some elements in the Greek writing look Demotic. Maybe this is something worth looking at. A phenomenon that has been studied, however, and very well studied, is the contact between Greek and Latin writing. And again, in Egypt, because that's where the documentation mostly comes from. And there's even a phenomenon that was described and identified and described by Guglielmo Cavallo already in the 1970s, the so-called Greco-Latin koine. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire for 7 centuries, including the Eastern Empire. But during all this period, Latin never had a role comparable to that of Greek or Egyptian, either as a vector of communication or as a language of culture. As linguist Jim Adams says, Latin was in Egypt a super high language. It was the language of the imperial authority, which was the highest, but at the same time distant power in the Roman, in the empire. Learning of Latin by Greek and Egyptian speakers was never widespread and occurred mostly when prodded by necessity or interest. In other words, Egyptian and Greek-speaking people in Egypt would only learn Latin when they had to, mostly to move higher in government careers. Only in a few instances did the Romans impose the use of their language for administrative purposes. And that happened mostly in the 3rd and 4th century as a consequence of Diocletian's reforms. In this period, Latin starts having a stronger presence in Egypt, but a largely symbolic presence. In bureaucracy, in the military, and in juridical proceedings. We have from the 4th century mostly documents like the one you see on the screen, minutes of court hearings, where you have the initial part of the text with the introducing formula, the dating, etc., in Latin. Then the main body of the text with the contents of all the proceedings that had to be understood by whoever was involved in this in Greek, and then the final portion also in Latin. Which means that at this point, professional scribes who wrote Greek also had to write Latin, so they had to learn Latin writing. But Greek and Latin are not very different. It's all in all, it's the same writing system or 2 variants of the same writing systems. What is interesting is when this occurred, when this contact between Greek and Latin occurred in Egypt, the 2 scripts were on a different stage of evolution. Oh, I'm sorry that this is sort of looks weird. In the 3rd century, the Greek cursive was still a majuscule script. A majuscule script is defined sort of technically as a script that is where the lines are comprised, the letters are comprised between 2 lines. Whereas the minuscule script is the letters are comprised between the quadrilinear scheme, so between 4 horizontal lines. The Greek cursive in the 3rd century was still a majuscule cursive, but in the Roman world, in the Latin world, there had occurred in the 3rd century a very big transformation in writing, which was the passage from the majuscule to the minuscule. It is a very complex phenomenon I won't have time to go into today, but basically in the Rome, Latin was already using a minuscule type of cursive, while the Greeks were still using a majuscule. When the context between the 2 scripts happening, the Latin script, which is already minuscule, and so had a very, very strong influence on the Greek script. And thus emerged what Cavallo called the koine, a kind of script that was, if you will, a mixture, was neither Greek nor Latin. It was both at the same time, a mixture of elements of both the scripts, but with a stronger influence from the Latin on the Greek than the Greek on the Latin. Here you see it's from the same document that I showed before, just 1 line in Latin and 1 line in Greek. You can read the transcription, but just to show here you can still see clearly without attempting to read, just by looking at where that the Latin and the Greek are distinct. But looking closely, you can see that many letters are the same. The deltas, for instance, in Greek are written like the Latin D. The mu also in Greek, the M looks like the mu. The pi followed by another letter, like here in hypo, looks like a mu, a Latin M, so on and so forth. The Greek alpha is written like a Latin A. There is a correspondence between many characters, and it's usually the Greek character that will look like the Latin character. Just another example coming from the same archive, the archive of Flavius Abeneus, so another group of of documents that belonged to some point to the same person. And in this archive, we have both Greek and Latin documents, and there you can see what this phenomenon, how this phenomenon happened. This photo is not super. I'm sorry, but it's the only one we have. This is a Latin document written in this minuscule cursive that I was talking about. And this is a Greek document. And you can see, even without looking in detail, that the Greek writing sometimes somehow looks like the Latin writing. It acquired the sort of the flow of the Latin cursive. And this is due to this intercontamination that we have in the Koine, in this very specific phenomenon. The Koine was a very important moment in the history of Greek writing, because it is from the Koine that the Byzantine cursive that will be used in the following periods emerges. This phenomenon seems to have originated in Egypt, but I have to say seems, because we cannot be sure without more elements to compare with, without other texts from other regions. It's difficult to be sure. We do have some papyri from elsewhere that are written in Koine, where we can see also this contact between the two scripts. But whether it is because it was born in Egypt and then spread out, or it was born elsewhere, we do not know. We can study the phenomenon mostly in Egypt, because that's where the documents come from. I have dealt so far mostly only with documentary scripts and not with the literary scripts, the other big chapter in Greek paleography. And there's a very good reason. Literary scripts, as I said before, are much more formalized scripts. We talk for literary scripts, we talk about canons, sort of about models, if you will, that were followed respectfully by scribes. Literary scripts tend to be much more conservative and to slow in transforming themselves. The transformation, the evolution of script is mostly seen in documentary hands, which were the everyday scripts used by people, while the literary scripts were used by professional copists who were trained and tend to sort of keep the same shapes, the same way of writing, and therefore there are fewer local variations, or at least it's more difficult with these very standardized scripts to note whether there is a difference between texts that come from a particular region or another. Especially in late antiquity. In late antiquity, literary hands become extremely stylized. Some paleographers even say fossilized typologies. You have basically, for the Greek world, three big types of scripts that are found in books from the, let's say, 3rd century onwards: the Biblical Majuscule, the Alexandrian Majuscule, and the sloping Majuscule. And they are almost the same everywhere, with perhaps in some cases, a bit of a variation, but it's very difficult to judge. what is interesting is that one of these literary scripts that we find mostly in late antiquity is an Egyptian script, is a literary script that we know with much certitude that it emerged in Egypt, and it seems to have been limited to Egypt. This is what it looks like. It is a script that it starts emerging in the 2nd century. That's where we have the first attestations in documents. So it has a documentary origin. It appears for documents. But with time, and especially from the 4th century on, it will be used mostly for books in literary texts. And it is characterized by sort of rather rectangular shapes, elongated vertical strokes, little buckles or loops ornamenting the letters. This script, which is once one is a bit used to Greek paleography, is one of those scripts that you identify it immediately when you see it. It was first called Ancien grec de type copte by Jean Irigoyen. That means Coptic style uncial, because it is a script that we see, or similar scripts that we see in Coptic manuscripts. Since then, it has been rebaptized, renamed Alexandrian Majuscule, again by Guglielmo Cavallo, because he found in a text by a certain Niketas David Paphlagon, a author from the 9th, 10th century, in one of his books, in one of his works, he's talking about a manuscript, an old manuscript written in an old script, and he calls this old script Grammata Alexandrina, Alexandrian letters. And Cavallo identified with some degree of certitude these Grammata Alexandrina as this script that you see here that had a documentary origin. So documentary origin used a lot in books. Here you see an example of a 6th century papyrus codex with Callimachus. But then in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries, this script was again reused for documentary purpose, but a very specific documentary purpose. It was the writing for official texts from the Patriarchy in Alexandria, and namely the festal letters. The festal letters were documents emitted by the Patriarch of Alexandria, announcing the date of Easter in a particular year. And we have a few of those letters conserved on papyrus, and they are written in this particular kind of script, the Alexandrian Majuscule, and usually very beautiful executions of the script, very, very calligraphic, as you can see in this one, which is dated from either 1713 to 1719, and it was sent by the Patriarch Alexander. And so this sort of reinforces the link between the script and Alexandria. We had the text by Niketas that calls it Grammata Alexandrina, and then you have its use on these documents. Unlike the Alexandrian Majuscule seems to have been a sort of a national script in Egypt, a national Greek script, because it is, with very few exceptions, not found in manuscripts from elsewhere, and it doesn't have an afterlife. Some of the other scripts used in this period, like the Biblical Majuscule, will still be used in Byzantine. We still find them in Byzantine manuscripts from Constantinople or other areas. The Alexandrian Majuscule, no, it seems to have disappeared at the same time that Greek started fading out in Egypt. It was adopted to write Coptic alongside the Biblical Majuscule, the two main scripts that were used for writing books in Coptic. So it will have a little longer life in Coptic than in Greek. This concludes my survey of Greek writing in Egypt. I'll just say that sort of in Hellenistic and Roman times, Greek was, of course, an epicenter of Greek civilization. One might argue that it was, at least in Hellenistic times, the vital core of Greek culture before the founding of Constantinople. And we know that the country had a very important role in the history of Greek writing, just as it did in the history of Greek literature. It is a bit frustrating that because of the lack of comparanda, the lack of material from other places, we cannot delineate, understand this role of Egypt in the development of Greek writing as well as we would have wished. But I suppose we have to be thankful that the Egyptian deserts have preserved so many examples, so many manuscripts from Greek antiquity that we otherwise wouldn't have at all. Thank you very much.